no automobiles in Canadian cities in the 1890s, very, very few in the decade after that, for that matter. Thousands of horses, not tens of thousands, but thousands of horses provided freight delivery, public transit, and carriage for the rich. To own a horse in a city in the 1800s, you had to have some serious cash because you had to have enough space for it. You had to have a stable for it. You probably had a groomsperson to take care of it. And chances are also you were not the one holding the reins as you were um, as you paraded around town in your horse and carriage. Hence the term carriage trade. It has its roots in the fact that in the cities, to own a horse and carriage was something that was really restricted to the upper classes and some professions that needed it for practical purposes, such as doctors. Everyone else walked, cycled, and took what at the time were horse cars. They were basically, you can see one here in this picture of Yonge Street in Toronto in 1890. They've already built tracks because they found that the horses could pull much more efficiently if the horse cars they were pulling were steel wheeled and rolling on tracks, but they're still being pulled by horses. Intercity travel was quite rare. I lived in Orleans for a number of years and I participated in the Cumberland Amateur Theater and learned a lot about the history of Cumberland and learned, among other things, that a trip from Cumberland to Ottawa, even as late as the 1920s, was a pretty big undertaking. It certainly wasn't a commute or a day-to-day experience. Most people got the services they needed and the goods that they needed within a pretty short distance from their home. And I came across another interesting concept in looking at this early period. It's something called uh, it's called the law. It's not really a law, but it's called the law of constant travel time. And it was developed by a couple of Europeans at the World Bank in the 1970s who noticed that people everywhere, regardless of the level of wealth in their society or the level of development of the economy in which they live, are very, very reluctant to spend more than 1 hour per day traveling. 1.5, they start to get very unhappy, and it's actually quite rare to see as much as 2 hours a day being devoted to transport, personal transport. And I'm talking about local travel now, not grand journeys. Most travel is local. And by that, I mean trips that you can start and end in the same day from your home. And when you look at the way our cities were built throughout history, you look at where the walls are around the ancient walled cities, you can see the distance that a person could walk and walk home again defined the size of those communities, defined the urban form and the spatial structure of those communities. And it was like that actually for pretty much all time when you think about it. So, what the car did to the concept of local is probably the biggest thing the biggest implication of its arrival on the scene. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But before moving on to that early history of the car, let me just say a little bit more uh, by way of tribute to the urban horse. The cities in the 19th century ran with horsepower. There were trains between the cities for freight, but it was horses that would haul the freight to and from the train yards. I've already referred to the omnibuses, the horse cars that were used for public transit. There were all manners of wagons for freight and deliveries, cabriolets, as they were called, which later got shortened to cabs, were carriages that were available for hire. And of course, there were the private carriages that I made reference to a moment ago. These were all part of the realm of the urban horse in the pre-automobile and pre-streetcar, pre-electric streetcar city. In the densely populated and burgeoning cities of North America in the late 19th century, it was a big problem. It was very clear that continued reliance on horsepower was just not sustainable in an urban environment. It was a public health hazard. A hard-working urban horse consumes over a ton of oats and 2 tons of hay per year and produces an equal amount of manure, as well as several hundred liters of urine. And while this problem did not reach the crisis levels in Canada's cities that it did in some of the larger American cities, it was definitely at a crisis level in Manhattan by 1890, where there were probably around 140,000 urban horses. It was high on the public agenda as one of the central public health problems facing the future of cities everywhere in the developed world. I think there were probably maybe 4,000 to 5,000 horses in Toronto when the population peaked. Maybe a total of 75,000 urban horses in all of Canada. So not a big number compared to the urban horse, the farm horse population, which according to the census of 1911 was somewhere around 2 million. But these were the horses that did all the work. And they were treated in the most disgusting manner that one can imagine. You see here in the upper left a picture of a dead horse lying on the street. The horses that pulled these transit carts would frequently drop dead of exhaustion from heart attacks while they were doing their job. In fact, in New York, there would be a backlog of dead horses on the streets because the crews that would have to go around and cut them up so that they could be moved and carted away couldn't keep up with the rate at which horses were dropping in the streets. In the bottom right-hand corner, you can see a picture taken on the waterfront in Toronto. This was considered entertainment, to have a horse climb a stairway and then drop a trapdoor out from under it so that it would plunge into the lake below. And you can see in the upper right corner the manure and the dirt. This is actually a street in New York taken around that time in the late 1880s, early 1890s. So it was a mess. One of the interesting things that I learned in this exercise, which surprised me, is that it wasn't the car that avoided this crisis from reaching completely unacceptable levels in Canada. It was the electric streetcar. The electric streetcar was probably one of the most quickly adopted technological innovations in history. And here you can see them working at laying the tracks in Adelaide and Church Street in Toronto. I think this was taken right around 1892, but I might have that wrong. You can see the horse is still the primary means of transport. You can see them going by on the detour platform that had been built while the tracks for the streetcars were being laid. Toronto electrified its first horse car line in August of 1892 and had the entire system electrified 24 months later in August of 1894. And it was a similar pattern throughout North America. These systems proliferated at an incredible pace in the early 1890s. So that by 1912, moving forward now, as we get into the period when the automobile really started to come on. I mean, cars were around in the very early 1900s, but they were still basically not for the common person. And you can see here in this interesting picture taken at Yonge and King in Toronto in 1912, the streetcars are there. The horse-drawn delivery vehicles are there. But if you look carefully at the automobiles that are on the scene at that point, they're pretty grand. They're driven by chauffeurs, and sitting up in the back seats, you can see the people that own those cars. And so the early car was expensive. It was well beyond the means of the average person to purchase one. They were built in a bespoke fashion. Carriage makers like McLaughlin here in Ontario were getting into it, but they were approaching it very much the way they had the carriage trade, which was as a craft as opposed to an industrial activity. But what happened in the next 10 years, from about 1910 to 1920, is really interesting. In 1912, there were maybe 20,000 personal motor vehicles registered across Canada. And a lot of those were Americans, because if you were an American at that time and wanted to drive in a Canadian province, you had to have your car registered in that province. And they didn't get the international registration bureaucracy sorted out until about 1915. So whenever you see registration statistics for Canada that predate 1915, the number is actually higher, considerably higher than the number that were Canadian registrations, because of this phenomenon of Americans motoring up to Canada who needed to register, have a registration in Canada in order to do that. Nevertheless, by 1920, we were at 252,000, plus another 150,000 commercial vehicles. And it doubled 2 more times in just 10 years. So by 1930, there were over 1 million registered personal motor vehicles in Canada. And that's just the personal ones, not counting the commercial vehicles. So it was an extraordinary growth curve. Here and doing this work, by the way, I delved into this historical statistics of Canada. It's so interesting. The statistics that were gathered on all sorts of things in the 1910 period, 1920s and 30s are very often much more detailed than what one will find today. And so it's very satisfying from a research point of view to be able to go back and see such detailed information on registrations of cars and other indicators that I'll be showing you as we go along here. But what you see here, there's 3 graphs. The top one shows you from the 1915 on the left to 1930. So the entire period covered here is only 15 years. And you can see the number of cars per household and per capita in the top graph, going from practically nothing in 1915 to 0.5 cars per household in 2030. In other words, every second household had a car by 1930. So we went from 0 to that in 15 years. In the middle chart, you can see an estimate on my part, using techniques I won't go into, of just how much these vehicles were traveled. And the interesting thing here is that it appears that once a household had a car, they really started driving it a lot, 10,000 kilometers a year right away. So I found that interesting, because it would have been much more mobility than would have been replaced if all they did with their car was use it for travel they were already doing. So right away, and I'll come back to this theme, the car created its own demand. It expanded mobility. And then the final shows the annual total vehicle kilometers traveled in billions over that 15-year period. And you can see it's just phenomenal rate of growth, leveling off in the last year as the Depression kicked in. There's a couple of interesting things I found along the way. In the early years, Saskatchewan, the car took off on the prairies faster than it did in Ontario. Here you see, for example, in Calgary, the top left-hand picture is 1909. You can see the streetcar, and you can see already quite a significant number of cars parked along the side of the street. And in the bottom picture, I think I've got these flipped. I'm sorry. I do. The bottom right is actually 1909 and the top left is 1915. So you can see some cars starting to appear in 1909, but still the horse-drawn conveyances right there, probably outnumbering the motor vehicles in downtown Calgary. And just 6 years later, you can see still a horse-drawn vehicle there in the center of the photo in the upper left, but the motor vehicle is clearly coming on strong. 1913, this is outside Eaton's department store in Toronto. These are their delivery vans, wagons ready to go out on their daily rounds. And you can see they've got 2 or 3 trucks there in the foreground, but all the rest of the wagons in 1913 were still horse-drawn. I mentioned or started to mention Saskatchewan a moment ago. Saskatchewan actually had the highest rate of early adoption of the motor vehicle in Canada. And here you can see again the transition. I've got these pictures mixed up, don't I? Didn't I just use that picture for Calgary a moment ago? Yeah, I'm sorry. The Calgary picture got hidden behind there. So that definitely looks like Saskatoon there. So what you can see is already the popularity of the car in farming provinces where the land is flat, the roads are flat and fairly dry most of the time. And the value of a farmer being able to get into town and back at a faster rate of speed than the horse-drawn buggy would allow was very highly prized. Similar set of pictures here from Winnipeg, 1894, already the streetcar well established. But by 1912, you can see the prevalence of the motor car coming in to the picture. This may surprise some of you. I know it's very small print, but each one of those lines represents the life and death of an electric streetcar system in a Canadian city. And there's a timeline along the bottom that starts at 1860. So you can see Montreal actually and Toronto were the first 2 communities to have street railways. But by 1900, 1910, still before the car had really made its big entrance, there were streetcar systems in virtually all Canadian cities of any size. And you can see also how quickly they all met their demise after World War II, where you see all of those lines ending is around the year 1950, with a few later day systems starting up in more recent years in Vancouver and Edmonton and Calgary. You can see Ottawa. I know many of you are from Ottawa. You can see Ottawa's system coming, disappearing around 1950s and reappearing again in the form of light rail there today. Another interesting insight that has relevance to the problems that we're facing of transition away from the type of automobile dependence we have is that the road system was already in place when the cars came along. In fact, the roads were basically built out in Canada long before the car came along. They weren't very good roads. They certainly weren't built for cars. They were built, if anything, for horse travel. But they were built, they were surveyed, they were cleared, they were leveled, and many of them were already asphalt covered by 1900. As opposed to the extent of the electric railway and steam railway, which was mainly an intercity system, the infrastructure structure to support the automobile was already basically in place before the car came along. Unlike a railway, you didn't have to clear through the forest and lay down steel rail and all the rest of it before you could start moving. With a car, you could just get on with it with the existing infrastructure, even while it was being improved. That's a logarithmic scale, by the way, on the y-axis. So you can see just how much bigger the road network already was than the rail networks by 1922. And we were showing some of these early pictures of Canadian cities a moment ago. Here's Toronto in 1924. I'll tell you an interesting thing I learned in doing this work. Photographers generally don't take pictures of normal situations. So if you're a researcher trying to get a photographic sense of what things looked like on an everyday basis back in the 1920s, you have to be very careful. This picture, for example, I learned was taken, I think, on Christmas Eve. So it's not going to be an ordinary street scene that day. Everybody's out doing their last minute shopping. And I've had to learn how to either take with a grain of salt or very carefully check the provenance of some of the photographs that I've been looking at to try and get a sense of how the car affected the streetscape back in those days, because photographers in general, newspaper editors don't send them out and say, take a picture of something completely uninteresting. So, but still, it's sufficient to show the mix of cars and streetcars. And also notice the way the pedestrians, I mean, I know it's Christmas Eve and all of that, but the pedestrians still felt a sense of ownership over the streets. They didn't feel that it was completely the domain of the automobile yet, although that day was very fast approaching. Here we see a 1924 traffic jam on Bay Street. That's the old Toronto City Hall there in the background. Many of you will know this particular stretch of road. And you can see in the foreground horse-drawn vehicle for delivery still in use at that point. They continued actually. I think they would have been gone by 1930, if not for the Depression and then World War II, which gave the horse-drawn delivery vehicle, which some people say was the first autonomous vehicle, its new lease on life. And even as late as 1922, the Eaton Department Store Company invested in a major new stable for its fleet of delivery horse-drawn vehicles and so on in Toronto. But it was soon overtaken, obviously. Again, the traffic jam had entered the lexicon by the end of the 1920s. Here you can see, I went looking for this picture this morning again, because I know a lot of you are from Ottawa. I don't know if this is Gladstone, but it's somewhere in Centertown, and it's a snow clearing operation in full swing. If you look carefully over at the right here, this would have been in the 1920s. I haven't been able to identify the precise date, but you can see this group of guys with shovels over here. They're the ones filling these wooden boxes that these newfangled truck vehicles are then carting away to who knows where. But the streetcar, once again, prevalent. I mentioned this earlier, and there's too many numbers here for people to get up, be in the version of this that gets distributed. But it's interesting. The green represents the fastest rates of uptake for different years. The years run down the left-hand side, and each column represents a different province. And you can see the phenomenon I mentioned earlier. In 1921, the highest rate of personal vehicle ownership was actually in the province of Saskatchewan. Ontario overtook that role in the 30s and 40s and 50s. But in more recent years, Alberta is now the province in Canada with the highest rate of personal vehicle ownership, where it's very common for a household to have more than 2 vehicles. The average is 2. And Quebec, of course, with its different urban form and spatial structure and housing pattern, its higher proportion of multifamily dwellings, which is built right into the fabric there, has always had a correspondingly lower rate of vehicle ownership per household than is characteristic of most of the rest of Canada. More pictures, more graphs, I should say. This one now extending to the year 2015. So in spite of that hyper growth that we saw up to the year 1930, look what happened later. What you see in the top is the growth in vehicles per household and per capita. In the middle, the vehicle kilometers traveled. These are the same things we were looking at earlier, only now for the whole period up to the present. And the bottom, the total vehicle kilometers traveled by Canadians in personal vehicles. And a couple of things to note here. One is explosive post-war growth in per household ownership of the automobiles, with a linear growth in per capita travel by automobiles. In the middle, you can see that the average amount of vehicle kilometers traveled per person and per household continued to grow up until about 1980, and it's really leveled off since then. Total still grows because population grows, but the amount of travel per person and per household has really not been growing in Canada for a long time now, 40 years. Comment on that perhaps later as well. This is where we are now. We drive over 400 billion kilometers a year. That's more than 2,700 times the distance from the Earth to the sun. And we do that every year. That's just Canada. That's the 401 across the top of Toronto during rush hour on a fall evening. Looks like fun, eh? People are doing that every day. Makes the Queensway look like a park. The another few sequences that I wanted to share with you. Here we see, again, drawing on these historical statistics that I was able to dig out, household spending on transportation. This, I think, is quite interesting if you take the time to think about it. That black dotted line is a percent. The percents run down the right-hand side of the graph. It's the percent of the average Canadian household's budget spending that goes to transportation. And it's almost all for the car, by the way. It's not 85, 90%. And a few things interest me about this. One is that I mean, the big dip is the war. So that's an anomaly. So what it's really telling me is that over the long sweep of history, the spending on personal transportation by households hasn't changed very much. It jumped when the car came along because cars that had households that had cars started spending a lot more than households that didn't. But once the saturation of the car caught up with that, it kind of leveled off there at about I think around 10%. Some people say it's more like 12. It's not the easiest number in the world to nail down because you have to draw on different sources to get all the different contributions to it. But something else that is interesting and maybe a little bit disturbing here is that the purchase of new vehicles as a share of the total. Actually, I'm sorry, I'm going to come back to that. I think the main point I wanted to make here was the extent to which total household spending up until 1948, which as far as this chart goes, we'll take a look at a later period in a moment, was pretty constant, except for the interruption represented by the war when gasoline was rationed and automobile production stopped. Now, here's where I wanted to go. Another one of these three-part graphs. Sorry about that. You probably weren't expecting so many graphs to have to try and understand this afternoon, but it's, for me, a way of seeing some of these big historical trends. So what we have here, first of all, in the top picture is the total spending by Canadian households on transportation right up to 2015, picking up where the last graph left off. And again, the dotted line across the top is the automobile share of household transport spending. So as I said, that's like 85% of household spending on transportation at this point is for the car, as opposed to transit or other types of purchased intercity transportation. Transportation share of household spending, you can see it's perhaps around 15% at this point, but it's remarkably level over this long, long sweep of time. Vehicle operation and purchasing of new vehicles contributing comparable amounts to the total. The middle chart repeats with a little bit more focus on the auto ownership costs, the spending of Canadian households. This is all, by the way, the dollars on all of these charts are in 2015 dollars to take inflation out of the picture. So when you see an increase in any of these charts, it's a real increase. It's inflation is not, it has been factored out. So what you see here, interesting, is the spending on new vehicles has been growing, and this trend has continued in the last few years. But operation, fuel, maintenance, insurance, and all of that has kind of leveled off. The bottom chart shows the total costs per kilometer of owning and running a car over this same period. Again, it's not really that dramatic, the growth in dollars per kilometer, somewhere right now just under 35 cents. And that's in spite of the fact that the price of gasoline over the long term since the OPEC events of the early 70s has been on a pretty steady and fairly steep climb. And we've managed to keep the total cost of owning and running a car from growing as quickly by making the cars more fuel efficient and by by making the cars more fuel efficient and in some ways making them smaller as well, although that trend is reversed. Now here, just to drive home this point about fuel efficiency, this may surprise you. 1920, Ford Model T, 750 kilograms, 15.7 liters per 100 kilometers. 1928, Ford Model A, we're up over 1,000 kilograms now, 15.7 liters per 100 kilometers. Jump forward to 1949 when we had those great big honking post-war cars. There's a Ford Custom, 1,430 kilograms, 15.2 liters per 100 kilometers. 1958 Chevy Bel Air. Now we're up to 1,700 kilograms, 15.7 liters. And the Impala, 1,700 kilograms, 15.5 liters. Remarkably, for that whole period from the Model T right up until the OPEC triggered reduction in fuel economy of automobiles was pretty much constant, even while the curb weight of those vehicles more than doubled. It's an underappreciated, I think, or not widely appreciated fact that there was a tremendous amount of engineering improvement going into the fuel efficiency of cars throughout this whole period as they got heavier and as features were added. And you can see it in graphical form here. Fuel efficiency in liters per 100 kilometer in the top graph, more or less constant. It actually started to go up in the late 50s and early 60s. And then bang, you can see the steep drop that as one of the ways that we responded, especially in Canada, to the rising cost of fuel. There was a period there for a number of years, not so much recently, where the average fuel efficiency of vehicles dropped, by a third. And you can see it reflected in the bottom chart, which shows billions of liters of fuel consumption by personal vehicles in Canada, growing. Remember how much it grew up until 1930? Well, that gets completely dwarfed by what happened after World War II, where it just skyrocketed. And then you see the leveling off during this period when fuel economy was improving after OPEC. Total fuel consumption was fairly steady. And now it started growing again in the 1990s. And it's growing slightly as we speak, but it hasn't and probably would never return to the kinds of growth rates that were characteristic of the 50s and 60s and 70s. I want to say a little bit about the roads. I don't have too much more material. You're probably starting to wonder when this is all going to end and how. But I mentioned earlier something that an advantage that the automobile had was that the infrastructure that it needed, in other words, roads, were already in place. By the end of the 19th century, there were hundreds of thousands of kilometers of roads in Canada. They weren't, as I said, great, but road pavement macadamization, as it was sometimes called, and other types of hard surfacing were quite common in our cities by 1900. In fact, the bicyclists were one of the groups that lobbied hard for better roads in the 1890s. Our priorities for their design tended to be, how can we design them so the horses aren't so loud and so that they're not as hard on the horses' hooves? Those are not the same design criteria that the automobile with its rubber tires is looking for. And so there was absolutely a need to rethink roads to support the car. And I picked Saskatoon for this picture, which was taken in 1912, because you can see those are not going to be difficult roads for cars to traverse. Those are the roads that were already there that the cars had to make do with. And you can see they're being shared by the horses and the cars at that point. And again, you can see the relatively early adoption of the automobile in Saskatchewan. It's quite remarkable. My guess is this is market day when the farmers have come into town, but nevertheless, that's a lot of cars for a downtown in 1912. Another one of my triptychs of graphs, this one just looking at government expenditures. Because what happened is very early in the 1920s, government started imposing gasoline taxes, and those taxes were not unpopular. Everybody, all the motorists at least, wanted the roads to be better, and they were willing to pay the tax if the money went into getting that job done. And so you can see, for example, in the middle chart, the expenditure by government on road infrastructure in billions of 2015 dollars per year. Again, this goes from 1924 to the outbreak of war. So you can see the dip from the depression that occurred in the 30s, but nevertheless, very strong growth throughout the 1920s as governments scrambled, mostly local governments, I might add, scrambled to keep up with the burgeoning demand for better roads from the automobile class. Most of our roads, even to this day, are not paved in Canada, but the growth of automobility is strongly correlated with the inventory of paved roads. That point comes out a little bit more here. In the top chart, you can see the red line is paved roads, and the black line is the total automobile vehicle kilometers of travel. I mean, they're practically on top of each other. So as the supply of paved roads increases, so too does the amount of automobile travel. And mirroring that in the middle chart is government expenditure on roads. And there, what's interesting and arguably concerning is the extent to which gas taxes and car registration revenue has, excuse me, started to fall short of government spending on road infrastructure, starting actually pretty much all the way back to the post-war period. And the gap between what our governments spend on the road infrastructure and what they collect in gas tax and registration revenue just continues to grow. A problem which could actually become of truly crisis proportions if the electric car starts to eat into the gas tax revenue, an issue which is of concern to people in government that are reliant, excuse me, reliant on gas tax revenue for the things that they do. Excuse me. I should speed through this. This is where we are today with our revenue, with our automobile road infrastructure, including who pays for it. And you can see most roads are local roads in terms of actual kilometers. We have these are basically thousands of kilometers, right? Thousands of kilometers. So there's over a million kilometers of roads in Canada. Probably over half of that already existed in 1900. But what's changed since then is, of course, is the share of those roads which is paved, which are paved, and supporting the, that all that billions and billions of automobile kilometers of travel that are going on. So I'm right near the end. I mean, this is pointing out what the urban face of all of this change looks like. That picture on the left is a composite. On the left-hand side is a 1939 aerial photograph of the Don Mills Road and Lawrence and Don Mills and Eglinton area. And on the right is what it looked like by 1965. And you can see there in the bottom right, that's Don Mills Road in Eglinton in 1975. It's not an unusual portrait of an urban arterial intersection in a Canadian city at this point. And you can see the extent to which the car dominates this landscape. The people look very small and very vulnerable against the presence of the automobile in these photographs. To sum up, it's an expensive system. We spend about $160 billion a year at the household level owning and operating our cars. I've shown you that chart already. The latest work I've been doing on this has been attempting to update the work Transport Canada did about 10 years ago on what else we're spending. And government expenditures on the road infrastructure in Canada are a little under $30 billion a year. And we've also made a stab at estimating how much we spend on parking. This is sort of the elephant in the room in some ways, because it usually gets left out of the total cost of the automobile. But we, and by we, I mean myself and David and his crew at U Calgary, figure it's at least $40 billion, not counting the land, just counting, the pavement and the facilities and the garages and all the rest of it. And if you put the land into the equation, it almost doubles. So you add all of this up and, you're up well north of $200 billion a year for maintaining this system. And against that, you have to ask yourself the question, the costs are going up. One of the interesting trends that we've seen is that when Canadians had an opportunity to reduce the share of their household spending on owning and operating an automobile, they chose instead to buy more car. Now, you could argue that they were cajoled by the advertising industry into that, or manipulated by the automobile industry into wanting a 2-ton SUV that you could drive across the Serengeti if you had to. But nevertheless, it's interesting to note that over the past 10 or 15 years, we could have reduced the share of our household income that we spend on owning and operating automobiles, and we did not. Instead, we bought bigger, more luxurious cars. And I think that embedded in that observation is an insight into the intransience of the automobile system and the depth of the love affair, really, that we have with the car. And I think some of the takeaways, and one of the reasons we haven't published this yet is we've had this long conversation about what all of this means, but the car is definitely much more than just a means of transportation. It completely changed the definition of local in a way that had never happened in all of history. When you go from the speed of a horse-drawn streetcar or an electric streetcar or walking or cycling, when you go from the size of your local territory that's defined by that speed to an automobile that can maintain a speed, even in the early days, of 60 or 70 kilometers an hour, well, the area that now becomes your local domain goes up by the square of that speed. And so it fundamentally changed the nature of human settlement patterns. And by 100, your locality became 100 times bigger. And we don't really drive because we like it. We drive because it gets us what we want. And when what we want is at the other end of the trip, typically. And so this expansion of locality is a very, very profound effect on the history of human civilization, both ecologically, culturally, economically, any way you want to approach the question of the human story. You can't help but include the impact of the automobile as a major factor. A second thing about the automobile is that along with this expansion in the territory to which we have local access comes a corresponding increase in the number of people that we can have regular contact with. And people love to be in touch with each other. I mean, most of us, we all know somebody who maybe isn't in that category, but generally speaking, innovations which make it easier for people to be in touch with each other are very popular innovations. And the automobile was one of those, as was the cell phone and the telephone and the radio and a number of other innovations in the last 100 years you can point to, where I think it's a reasonable conclusion that the reason they got taken up so quickly was because they were contributing to the ability for people to be in touch with each other. And this, I call this interconnected adjacency. And I think that when you invent something that expands interconnected adjacency, you're going to have an impact. People are going to want that. Affordability was the third thing that really jumps out at one. Up until the car came along, anything beyond a few kilometers of daily mobility was completely beyond the reach of the average person, partly through the genius of Henry Ford and other innovators of the time. This new innovation, the automobile, became something that was affordable and financeable by production workers as well as professionals in the 19 teens and 1920s. And I think that you can't underestimate, again, the contribution that made to the rate of uptake. Privacy and autonomy. This is why the rich loved their carriages in the first place, because it keeps them out of touch with the riffraff. And I think that lots of people sort of value the idea that they can go anywhere, anytime in their own little bubble, and that this is probably one of the compelling attributes of the automobile. And it became something anybody could have when the car became affordable. You didn't have to live within walking distance of where you worked anymore. So you could also begin to dream about having your country estate and your commute to work. Enhanced personal freedom. And finally, there's this issue of status, which is a difficult one to put one's finger on. But there was something about the car in the 1920s that made owning it a symbol of your membership in the modern age. This was the era of modernization, after all. And long before it really became a necessity, in fact, you didn't need a car to live in the cities of the 1920s. It became a status symbol to have one. And the fancier the car, the greater the status, a psychological reality that the automobile industry has preyed on with a vengeance over the decades, to the extent that the private automobile became an expression of one's identity, and still is to this day. Somebody tells you they own a Prius, you already know quite a bit about them. So I think that one has to be cognizant of this factor as well. So access, affordability, interconnectivity, status, freedom, these are all attributes of the car that have contributed to its astounding success and its deep-rooted and pervasive impact on our lives over the last 100 years. Has the system stalled? It might have. As I mentioned earlier, while the private cost of owning a car is fairly stable in real terms, the infrastructure cost is still growing and continues to grow, and probably needs to grow even more given the extent to which some parts of it have been neglected and allowed to fall into states of disrepair. And so you have and meanwhile, if you take the total distance that we travel in our automobiles and divide it not just by the time we spend in doing those trips, but also by the time that we spend making the money to pay for the insurance, to pay for the gas, to pay for the car, to pay for the taxes that support the infrastructure, the average speed, sometimes called the effective speed, is much less than the physically observed speed. The physically observed average speed of automobile travel in Canada is just under 40 kilometers an hour. When you add in these other factors and calculate the effective speed by including in the denominator all of the time we spend earning that money, it comes down to about 20 kilometers per hour. And it's declining. It's declining slowly, but those rising infrastructure costs are pushing it up. And meanwhile, bicycle improvements are getting pretty close to the point where a fit person can tour along at 20 kilometers an hour. So that's an interesting crossover. Ivan Illich would be proud. So what lies ahead? It's not obvious, clear. This business of travel time is an interesting one. The autonomous vehicle prospect raises the possibility that the law of constant travel time or maximum travel time that I referred to earlier, in which people do not want to spend and will not spend more than an hour and a half or 2 hours on average doing local travel in a day, that law may be torn down by the autonomous or the semi-autonomous vehicle. If you can live in Bancroft or somewhere in the Kawartha Lakes, get in your car at 6 in the morning and go back to sleep while it navigates the highway portion of your trip into the city, then the prospects for the impact of autonomy could be to increase or trigger a whole new approach to our attitude towards travel time. And we could see another type of urban sprawl start to develop. Some of us are seeing that as we live through the pandemic, and people are moving out of the big cities because they realize that they can live that way. So this question, will we spend more time in our vehicles? Will speeds go up or down? What will happen to the streetscape? That's an interesting one. The autonomous vehicle supposedly is going to be programmed so that it won't kill people. This seems to me means that any pedestrian anywhere will be able to step out in front of an autonomous vehicle and bring it to a complete halt. I don't understand how you can introduce that kind of technology into an urban environment without causing total gridlock. And so there is a potential revenge of the pedestrian on the horizon, in which they will be able to take back the streets to a certain extent. And obviously, that's probably not going to be allowed to happen. You know, the the lobby for the car versus the pedestrian, it's a battle that goes all the way back. The very term jaywalker was a jay was somebody from the country who didn't know how to behave in the city. And the term jaywalker was used for people that would try to cross the street anywhere except at a designated intersection where there was a stop sign or perhaps a traffic light later on. Boy Scouts were given little cards that would shame people who jaywalked, that they would hand out to them if they saw them crossing mid-block. And there was pushback, obviously. There was a lot of outrage over traffic fatalities, particularly those involving children. But in the end, it was not a battle that the pedestrian ever really had a chance of winning. And the streetscape became the completely dominated domain of the automobile. You'll recall from some of those early photographs, the mix of pedestrians and horse-drawn vehicles and streetcars on the streets and people crossing every which way wherever they wanted to. That world is long gone. And the automobile basically has complete dominion over the streets, which are, you know, commons and developed all the way back to the pioneers who had a condition on their land often of developing the road next to their property. So the ownership and the sense of public right to the streets, it goes very, very deep in Canadian society. And there's a chapter of the story still to be written about what the future of our streetscape will look like, and what the changing technologies of automobiles, how that will influence it. So this was untimed and unrehearsed. I've used up a lot of time. I used a whole hour. I hope you're not all sleeping out there on mute. I wanted to end with a Marshall McLuhan quote that grabbed me when I was getting ready for this. The car has become a carapace, the protective and aggressive shell of urban and suburban man. And I found this photograph that I thought added a bit of drama to McLuhan's insight. Thank you for those of you who have stuck with me. I will stop now and turn it back over to our hosts. And there will be a version of these slides that will be circulated. I want to do a few edits, and then it will be posted by the Club of Rome.
Thank you, Ralph. It's wonderful to have history from an energy analyst. We normally expect graphs and calculations, but that was just super. I particularly like your term, revenge of the pedestrian, although I have to add a thought to that. We are probably much more vulnerable to the cyclists than we are today, which is already a problem. So let me ask you a question, Ralph. I've been thinking for some time that carbon taxes on consumer motor fuels are likely to be totally ineffective. And boy, have you given me a lot of ammunition. Do you got any views? What's your view on the federal preoccupation with carbon tax on consumer fuels?
Yeah, my background is in physics, like you, John, and so I'm always looking for the causal relationships, not the presumed relationships. And what I see when I look at the contribution that fuel and electricity costs make to the cost of doing just about everything, it's a pretty small number. It's a bigger contribution to the cost of owning and operating a car than it is to most things, but it's still not something that's going to turn on. And having said that, there is a psychological impact of carbon taxation. which is temporary, and it'll last for a few years, maybe quite a few years if they keep increasing it. And that's a useful thing. And we've seen that, much of the success of the BC carbon tax, in my view, was actually a mass psychological response and not a rational economic man response. Rational economic man wouldn't bother worrying too much about the levels of carbon tax that have prevailed to date because they have so little influence on the total factor cost of most things. Obviously, if you're running a steel mill or a paper mill, um, or a power plant that runs on fossil fuels, it's a different story. But for the vast number of human endeavors and activities, from owning and operating a home, or owning and operating a car, or running a manufacturing facility, fuel and electricity prices are not the thing that your decisions turn on. I mean, I tend to agree with you on this, that the the direct effectiveness of carbon tax in influencing decision on economic calculus that goes into people's decisions is very muted, and has taken up a lot of oxygen in the policy debate room that maybe could have been more effectively devoted to both regulatory measures and other types of interventions in the economy that would have achieved greater levels of efficiency and technological innovation at a faster pace than the rather blunt instrument of a carbon tax.
Thank you. I've got a list of speakers here. The first one is John Legg, followed by Zach and Martin Riddle. John Legg, can you pose a question as short as mine was?
I can pose one, and if it's too far away from the original goal of your presentation, Ralph, I will pick up a question someone else has already posed, which I also would like to put to you. The quick one is something that you are working on, according to your bio, and you talk about working on a policy approach for the mass retrofit of Canadian buildings. And obviously, this is an energy question. And if this is too much of a lurch away from that wonderful presentation, then I will pick up on Bill Pugsley's question about Europeans threatening to ban cars from city centers. So I'll let you choose. They're both of great interest, I think. Over to you after that wonderful presentation.
Thank you, John. It is a topic that I've been working on for the past year, really, along with Brendan Haley, who's the policy director at an organization, an NGO called Efficiency Canada, which advocates for a greater role for and a greater support from government for energy efficiency in our response to climate change. The paper is out for review that we've written on this, and the reviews are due in today, actually. So it will be published in the next 2 or 3 weeks, at which time you may want to have Brendan and or myself come and go into it in more detail. But essentially, there's a quantitative element to it in which we've estimated what it would cost and what it would take to bring the level of energy efficiency of all 9 million buildings in Canada down to a level that was sustainable and supplyable by renewable electricity. And then there's a policy component to the paper that takes off from the work of Mariana Mazzucato, which some of you are probably familiar with, and argues for a mission-oriented approach in Canada to the task of getting this job done. We're talking about retrofitting our existing buildings to make them climate friendly. And unlike a lot of the other major components of the transition to the low carbon future, for example, electrification, we can sort of get a view of what the renewable electricity sector could look like once it's finished going through that transition, and what the new decentralized smart grid will look like. There's very exciting vision and lots of business strategies and public policies to go with it that are reaching a pretty high stage of development and applicability. Similarly, with respect to electric vehicles, there are some gaps, but we're starting to get a vision, a concrete vision of what a future in which the transportation sector runs mainly on electricity, with perhaps some other biofuels and renewable fuels contributing in certain segments. And we can start to see what that will look like and what the infrastructure will look like and how we can get there. But when it comes to retrofitting the buildings, which is just as necessary as those other elements, the path forward is much murkier, and it's much more likely that it's going to require a fairly complete severance of business as usual with regard to the business practices of the existing building renovation industry in order to go from what we do now, which is less than half of 1% of our buildings per year, to what it would take to get to the point either by 2035 or by 2050. We run two scenarios in the paper where we could look back and see that we had the existing building stock changed over to a more efficient, largely electrified state. To get that transition done, we need business strategies, business models, and public policies that we're still in the process of dreaming up, I would argue, but we're getting there. And our paper is really more of a contribution to a conversation that still has a way to go than it is by any means the final word on how this could be or should be done. But we're trying to jump the conversation away from it's got this incrementality has got a tenacious hold on the way we think about the retrofitting of our buildings. And we've got to shake loose of that and start to think in a much more transformative way and think about what the positive disruptive policies could be for that necessary contribution to the low carbon transition.
Thank you very much. Thank
We'd
you.
be happy to come back. Unlike this topic, this paper that I was talking about today, I drafted a year ago, and it's just been sitting because I've been trying to write the final section of it. So you guys were sort of victims of what was essentially me dusting off my thinking on something that I have not been actively working on. But the retrofit one, yeah, I'm right in the midst of that. And Brendan and I would be happy to come back and talk about it if you like, anytime after about a month from now.
Thank you, Rob. Martin Riddle, you're you're speaking.
Thanks, John. Ralph, great presentation. One question: what have we learned, if anything, through the pandemic and working from home and car usage and so on?
I think there's probably different answers to that for different types of lifestyles and people. I think that for people who have been either required to or forced to work at home, some of them have discovered that it's a preferable lifestyle that involves much less need to be moving around, much less need to be going into work every day and coming home. And we will likely see a permanent, irreversible shift towards a greater portion of the workforce choosing that lifestyle. There are other people who do not like it at all. Their house is not physically set up for it. It's perhaps not large enough for it. There may not be a home office environment where they can work. They may have small children that make it difficult, and who are and they miss the social interaction of the office place or the workplace, and who are very much looking forward to going back to work. But even for that group, I think we're probably going to see an understanding that maybe they don't have to be there every day. So I think we may see a change in a permanent reduction in commuter patterns after the pandemic runs its course. But I don't know. Certainly, there's a lot of empty office space in the core of our cities, and some of the bigger organizations in the financial services industry, for example, are shedding that space, which suggests that they don't think everybody's coming back. So there's also people who are actually purchasing properties that are outside of commuting distance from Toronto, who work in Toronto, whose jobs are based in Toronto. People are buying houses in Kingston who have jobs in Toronto. People are buying houses in Kingston who have jobs in Ottawa. That's not a commute you're going to want to do every day. So that suggests that there's also a segment of the population that is determined to maintain a lifestyle after the pandemic, which does not draw them back into the big city on a day-to-day basis. So, so there's that. I don't know. I just think that it's we already had a situation among the younger generation where car ownership and aspiration to car ownership is much lower than it was for my generation, and so that's another factor that's in the mix here. So there's a lot of moving parts to what the post-pandemic period will look like with regard to mobility and the way we access employment and goods and services.
Ted Manning, please take the mic.
Yeah, I'm going to do two different cuts on this one, Ralph, which may or may not help. Some of us now consider our car to be a sealed, secure place to stay as we go from place to place, not having to interact with anyone else. And I think that some of that has been fed by the pandemic. So in some places, I think there are actually more people who are afraid driving than they would be taking public transit. And that may well factor over some time. Also, the other side of this is that, and I put a contrast in that in Europe, there have been some very active government activity to stop people from coming downtown with vehicles. Places like Singapore or London, you just can't afford to park a car downtown anymore. But of course, in both cases, they have very effective public transport systems. So I'm just wondering, how much of that can we in fact see as a model that might play out here as things change?
Well, I think the last point you made about the importance of twinning any punitive policy to either prohibit or tax automobile presence in the core has to be done in a strategic, planned way so that you provide mobility options to people who are in the core. I think Portland, Oregon is one of the poster cities for having started out on this path in I think around 1990. They gradually started to change their normal zoning laws about having builders having to put in a minimum number of parking spots when they will put up a building. They changed it to a maximum number, and they gradually ratcheted that number down and down, and then eventually changed their central business district over to a pedestrian only district. And it's wonderful. And the merchants love it, but they did it while at the same time developing transit options. I believe, I don't know if they still have it, but a big part of it was free transit downtown. You can hop on and off anywhere. And so it gives people the mobility that the convenient mobility that they need if they're not going to be able to have their car. And let's face it, having a car in a central business district is, if it ever was any fun, it sure isn't not. It's not now. I mean, it's an awful thing. And so I think there is a reimagining of the way that central business districts can become much more amenable to pedestrian only environments. And but yeah, it's got to be done. And you can't just wake up one morning and say cars can't come anymore. It has to be. It took Portland 20 years to get to the point where they could say, I think we finally got there. And
you can't ban cars in a democracy.
Yeah, well.
On the other hand, there are other governance models around the world who have succeeded in banning them. And it's in some cases, it's caused considerable harm to their social order.
I don't, the question of that was veiled inside your question, and which I should have mentioned in my previous response, is whether we're going to see a change in attitude towards taking public transit
Yeah.
after the pandemic, or whether people are going to be afraid to be in close quarters like that. And that's an interesting one. My view is that mass transit, the whole concept of mass transit, which is really, it was conceptualized, 50, 60, 70 years ago, was already in trouble, in the sense that people want to be able to go everywhere, anytime they want, from anywhere to anywhere. The origin destination patterns of our cities are much more spread out in space and time than they were when these fixed link mass transit systems were conceptualized in the post-war and even in the pre-war period, for that matter. And so I think that public transit was in for a disruptive transition even before the pandemic came along, and this may accelerate it.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. John Meyer, please take the microphone.
Yeah, thanks. That was very interesting. I just wanted to make an observation, and I think that perhaps people have bought into this large vehicle process because trucks unaccountably were allowed to take off in our marketplace. And in order to see around or over a truck's hood, you have to be driving at least a compact utility vehicle. You can't do that with a regular sedan. So I think there is a bit of a road going more of upsizing on the going on. But question, okay, a few years ago, I looked at all the money that they were spending in Toronto on infrastructure, public transit infrastructure, of which I'm a huge supporter. Although it's more difficult now in the pandemic era. And I calculated that if the government gave everyone a free $15,000 electric car, about the size of a Smart, that they could do away with the public infrastructure and have everything running on the surface. If you had small cars, and by small I mean narrow. I think narrow makes traffic flow. I don't think car length is too important, but I think if you had a 2-lane roadway that became 3-lane and a 4-lane that became 7-lane, I think flow in a city would flow problems would go away. But the question is, doing away with public transit by going with very small vehicles, mandatory very small vehicles, and of course you would have automation becomes autonomous driving becomes another issue that would maybe enable that. But on a dollar basis, do you think that would allow people to keep their freedom of mobility and allow a city to function on by moving enough people? Is there enough road surface that traffic moves fast enough to be able to get rid of public transit?
Wow, that's a pretty radical idea.
Yeah, I thought I'd throw that at you, so
Yeah.
I'm not expecting you have an answer.
I mean, what I can say is that historically attempts to increase the capacity of the roads, whether by, setting lanes aside for vehicles that have multiple passengers or whatever, have tended to result in increased numbers of people using the roads. So increasing the capacity of the roadway system has historically drawn people out of transit and back into their cars. It's been one of the unintended consequences of high occupancy vehicle lanes in many cities, for example, is that people who were taking transit started carpooling. So it's a complicated system. And I think you may run into, the people who are looking at autonomous vehicle scenarios have pretty much concluded if these are not shared vehicles with more than one passenger in them, then we're in for a world of pain in our central areas in terms of the congestion that will ensue from a massive move towards individual autonomous vehicles. If that's the way everyone is trying to get downtown, I don't, maybe you could alleviate the problem by having 7 lanes instead of 4, but
Yeah, I would
You'd
think
have to
it would
run the
come down-
numbers.
Yeah, I would think it would come down to size to a fair degree if you had everything the size of smaller than a smart.
And
So
where are you going to park? Yeah.
you're talking modules in effect. But anyway, I think it's an interesting possibility.
The
But
amount of space that a car takes up is partly related to how fast it's moving as well, you know, so
Yeah.
not just the size of the car itself. It's a fascinating mathematical problem, but
yeah,
I don't think I should even try.
if everyone is talking to each other in terms of autonomous cars, then they can form up. But anyway, that's another question. I just wanted to throw it at you. Thanks for your answer.
Ralph, we've run for an hour and a half. Are you got any competing appointments, or are you ready to quit because we've tired you out?
I had a 3 o'clock meeting. I'm just going to let them. They're going to record it for me, though. It's somebody who's leaving who's telling us how she does her job, so the rest of us can try and do it after she's gone. But I understand that it's being recorded, so I'll just let them know I'm going to be a bit longer.
Okay, doke. Time limit for you?
I'm not too good with time limits, as you know.
You always deliver on time, so what's the problem? Anyway, so look, Art, you turn off the recording whenever you judge appropriate, and but you're the next question up. Maybe you're the last recorded question, but wait till Ralph has sent his message, please. A moment.
It's okay. I can. You're not seeing me do this, are you?
No.
No.
Okay.
You're good.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
We hope it's all proper and clean.
John, you seem to have missed Zach and a couple of other people that have been waving at you. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Zach has already had a go.
No, he hasn't.
He didn't.
I missed him. I thought I had him up early. Okay, sorry, I may have made a mistake. Okay, Art, are you going to cede to the gentleman I ignored?
By all means, let Zach go ahead. As long as I can get at Ralph sometime.
Okay, Zach, sorry about that.
Okay. Well, my left hemisphere is here. My right hemisphere, however, left in a huff. Drove off in a huff. Interesting automobile that. Listen, I was most of what I had to say is irrelevant by now, but two things are. One is, listen, even if everybody had access to a shared car, if everybody took the same number of trips, I don't think they'd save any fuel. I don't think that would actually help the climate very much. Do you have any stats on that?
Well, the autonomous vehicle scenarios almost invariably presume that the vehicles will be electric.
Okay.
So, and that's
very nice in Ontario, where the electricity comes from nuclear or hydro. But if it's in, let's say, Alberta, where it's all from coal, I think, or Nova Scotia for sure, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, those jurisdictions that are still using fossil fuels to make electricity need to stop doing that if we're going to effectively respond to climate change. And in Canada, that problem is most severe in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Nova Scotia, as you pointed out. And all three of those provinces are working pretty hard to reduce fossil fuel consumption in their grids. Alberta right now is doing it by substituting natural gas for coal, which is not a satisfactory long-term solution, but it's better than burning coal. And similarly in Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia is leaning very hard on imports through the Maritime Link. And I think in the long term, it's going to have to find a way to bring more hydro in from Quebec if they're going to achieve a zero carbon grid, either that or offshore wind. And Alberta and Saskatchewan actually have the best, the southern prairies are probably the best solar regime in all of Canada, and also very strong wind regimes. So they, they've got some help from their natural endowment, I think, in the transition that they're going to have to undertake. Plus, they're next door. Alberta's next door to BC, and Saskatchewan is next door to Manitoba. And this century-old habit we have in Canada of balkanizing our electricity systems, where you've got hydro-have and hydro-have-not provinces right beside each other, not engaging in a level of trade that would bring the, clean electricity flows right across the country. We've got to get past that. And I know that the Infrastructure Bank is looking at how they can help that. And hopefully we're going to see some progress on, especially on enhanced connections between Quebec and Atlantic Canada, between Quebec and Ontario, between Alberta and BC, and between Manitoba and Saskatchewan. There are synchronization issues, but they're quite solvable. And the benefits of better east-west flow are one of the keys to the carbon transition in Canada, east-west flow of electricity.
Thank you.
Arthur.
Okay, I guess, Ralph, you're not aware that I have been running a microgrid. I've totally eliminated hydrocarbons from my heating of the house, cooling of the house, in all my driving, and I've been doing this for 5 years. Now, in the process, a few things have happened to my way of thinking, because now I think almost totally in an energy dimension, because I live it that way. I also look at my electric vehicle as more than just a fuel change. It is, in fact, a battery on wheels. I am now in the process, interestingly, on Friday, I pick up my Tesla Model 3, and I've got an extended battery in it. And the reason why I'm buying the battery, I am not, and it just happens to be a vehicle as well. Now, why would I do that? Because I'm integrating that into my building, into my home, which means that now with vehicle to grid interaction and exchange, it means that I can go much longer without having to ever connect to the grid to in fact survive in the advent of a total grid failure. Now, in this way, I suspect that we're going to see more systems that are coming online, because it's certainly happening in other parts of the world, where these microgrids are becoming more and more popular, becoming a distributed energy resource for the grid is becoming quite a popular thing in other parts of the world. In Ontario and Canada, we're lagging quite a bit in these worlds, but it doesn't mean it's not going to come. And I suspect it's going to come faster than ever. And everyone, I believe, who becomes a DER is going to become an energy thinker. You think in terms of kilowatts and kilowatt hours with ease. It's not a hard thing to do. And you can still have your love affair with the automobile and still be able to get around. For example, with my system, I don't pay anything for fuel. I get it all from my solar system. That doesn't mean that I drive more. You know, conventional economics just doesn't work. Maybe it's just me, but the mere fact you drop your fuel cost to zero doesn't mean that I'm driving infinitely more miles. No, not at all. I've said quite a bit here, but what I'm trying to say here is I believe that this disruption that is coming with electric vehicles is quite substantial. It's going to change the way we think, the way we live, and the way we get about and interact with society. And John Meyer has mentioned a couple of things, but I think there's other surprises which are going to come as well as we get into complete electrification of and elimination of fossil fuels. I guess I'm just asking for your comments on that.
Well, I mean, I agree. I don't understand why the vehicle to household and the vehicle to grid potential of the electric car is not a bigger topic of conversation and attention than it is, because the amount of electricity that's available, that will be available in a typical electric car at the end of the day, is probably greater than the total household electricity consumption from the period, let's say from 6 p.m. until bedtime. And so these are not small batteries. And just like our fossil fuel cars, we only fill them up, every week or two? We don't fill them up every night. But with the electric car, it's going to get topped up every night, after midnight, probably, when the electricity system is least stressed. And there's no reason why it can't be contributing to the peak hour load, and it will be. And then the microgrid is just one step further, where you're connected to your neighbors, or where your car is feeding maybe a local battery that is located on the corner in a box, like they do in Holland. You see them, the electric storage. So there's a tremendous amount of innovation happening with respect to electrification and the new grid. And you put your finger right on what I think is going to be one of the most interesting ones. Another one, of course, is the heat pump, which has an efficiency 3 times that of a baseboard heater. Even in cold climates, they're achieving seasonal efficiencies well above 2.5. And what this means in a country like Canada, where in most provinces, unfortunately not in Alberta and Saskatchewan so much, but in most provinces, there's enough electric resistance heating in use that just by switching that over to heat pumps frees up enough electricity to essentially power a good part of the electrification of the vehicle fleet. So there's a lot of positive surprises that are coming out of the synergies that come to the surface when you start looking at things the way you do, with a whole systems perspective.
Okay,
Art, I think you're going to
I
have
just want to make one quick comment, and that is that I get all my heat from a ground source heat pump, and I have a coefficient of performance at sometimes as high as 15. So the 3.5 for an air-to-air heat pump is, if you use the geothermal, I'm only down 2 meters, and I'm getting enough geothermal to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking earlier about the need for provincial trade in electricity. In Quebec, 80% of the building space heat is currently being provided with baseboard heaters. If you converted that to heat pumps, the amount of electricity that would be freed up for other applications, including electric vehicle charging and converting other buildings to electricity that are now on fossil fuels, is about 50 terawatt hours a year. That's like a James Bay. So, and again, this is something we talk about in the paper Brendan and I have just finished, that we're missing some of these, the importance of some of these unintended but very large and positive consequences of electrification and efficiency.
Quickly, Ralph, I just should tell you that the NRC is working on a total rewrite of all of the building codes right now. And then if you want to talk to me, my daughter's running it. But if you are in touch with it, please continue. If you're not, I'll put you in touch.
Okay.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we need to liberate our gracious speaker in about 10 minutes. And I'm going to ask Jean to thank our speaker now. I have 4 people left on the list. We won't have enough time to get you all on deck, I'm afraid. But if you like to turn off the recording after Jean's remarks, Art, that's fine. And anybody who likes to stay, please do that. So Jean, please.
Thank you very much, Ralph, for an absolutely wonderful presentation. You've not quite streamlined with one of the things that Cobourg has been involved in, which was a Pathways project that we launched a few years back, where we were looking at what ways in which we could contribute to Canada's reduction of greenhouse gases. And the thing we hit upon was transportation and the electrification of the grid. So, I mean, you give substantial data that supports that, and you've given it a historic context too, which is really, really interesting. I found your talk fascinating today. So on behalf of all the people of Cobourg, I would like to thank you very much for coming and giving us this presentation today. And I do look forward to hearing the talk that you and your co-conspirators will be producing with respect to your energy papers that you're looking at right now. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. It's been my pleasure.